Form 7 Biology, Energy Flow, Ecosystem and the Environment. Topic 5C, Environment and Climate Change. Learning objectives. Students should understand the relationship between cross primary productivity and net primary productivity, and they should know how to calculate the efficiency of biomass and energy transfer between the trophic levels. They should understand the different types of evidences for climate change. Students should understand the causes of anthropogenic climate change, and they should understand how knowledge of carbon cycle can be applied to methods to reduce atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, and they should understand the data that can be extrapolated to make predictions, and that these data are used in models for future climate changes. Students should understand the effect of climate change on plants and animals, and they should know the effect of temperature on the rate of enzyme activity. They should understand how evolution happens and how speciation take place in a population, and they should understand the way in which scientific conclusions about controversial issues such as what actions should be taken to reduce climate change or the degree to which humans are affecting climate change can sometimes depend on who is reaching the conclusions. And finally, they should understand how reforestation and the use of sustainable resources, including biofuels, are examples of the effective management of the conflict between human needs and conservation. All living things need energy, and it's originally coming from the sun. Producers can take the energy from the sun and convert it into food, and that energy which is stored inside the plants can get passed along a food chain. So here is a typical food chain. Grass is the producer here, and it converts sun's energy into food from the process called photosynthesis. The arrows indicates the direction of the energy flow. Here the grasshopper, being the primary consumer, eat producers. They are always herbivores. They use the molecules in plants to supply the raw materials needed for their metabolic reactions. In this example, the secondary consumer is a frog. So usually secondary consumers are the animals that feed on herbivores. These animals are usually carnivores. They use the molecules in the herbivores to supply the raw materials needed for their metabolic reactions. The snake here is the tertiary consumer, or the top predator. These are the animals that feed on other carnivores. If there is another consumer in the ecosystem who depends on snake, in that case it would be the quaternary consumer or the top predator. Each organism has a position in a food chain. So we name that position in that food chain as the trophic level. In an ecosystem, there are decomposers in any set of feeding relationships. They are usually microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi that breaks down remains of animals and plants and return the mineral nutrients to the soil. But decomposers are rarely included in a food chain. Here is an illustration of a terrestrial food chain as well as a marine food chain. So I hope that you can identify the producers and consumers in the food chains. In reality, many food chains overlap with each other. You don't really find one food chain on its own in an ecosystem. Food chains interrelate with each other to a certain extent. Collectively, we call it as a food web. You should be able to interpret and suggest what would happen if a certain organism die and what kind of an effect would it make in the ecosystem. Ecological pyramids. Trophic levels in an ecosystem and the energy flow from one level to the next level can be graphically depicted. The base of the pictorial depiction is always a producer, and the apex is formed of the final level of consumers. This is a simplified pyramid-shaped model which can help us to understand the energy economy of the ecosystem. There are few types of ecological pyramids. The first one is number pyramid. It shows the number of organisms in each trophic level and doesn't take it into consideration the size of the organism. The emphasis is only on the number, whether the organisms are big or small. Consider a food chain in a pond ecosystem like this. The producers are phytoplanktons. The primary consumers are zooplanktons. Then comes small fish and large fish. It's quite obvious that the number of phytoplanktons are higher than the number of zooplanktons, and the number of zooplanktons are higher than the number of small fish. The number of large fish is lesser than the number of small fish. So, this number pyramid is said to be an upright pyramid. And there are exceptional cases like the inverted number pyramid and the spindle shaped one as well. Pyramids of biomass. Pyramids of numbers doesn't accurately reflect what is happening in an ecosystem, but a biomass pyramid will give us a more realistic mode as it shows the combined mass of all the organisms in a particular habitat. For the construction of this pyramid, we can take either the wet or dry biomass. But taking wet biomass into consideration is inaccurate, as it affected by the water uptake of soil, evaporation of plants, the amounts of water which an animal drinks and excrete. So, this biomass pyramid is a model of feeding relationship that represents the biomass of the organisms at each trophic level in a food chain, and the size of organism is emphasized here. Pyramids of energy. The energy pyramids indicates the total number of energy present in each trophic level and also shows the loss of energy from one trophic level to the next. The energy flow between the trophic levels are accompanied by a decrease due to waste and the conversion of the potential energy into kinetic and heat energy. We have to remember that the energy in an ecosystem remains the same at each level. It's the size of different energy stores that changes. Less energy is stored in the organisms and more energy is stored in the surrounding atmosphere as we move along a food chain. So let's have a look at the given example. Plants have the highest amount of energy. Out of all the energy that the plant takes in, 90% of the energy is going to be used to keep the plant alive. When the plant is eaten by a herbivore, in the primary consumer level, 10% of the energy that's available to the plant is going to move on. As you go up, same thing happens. So there is less energy available in each level. Now here's a question for you. The diagram below shows the flow of energy in part of an ecosystem. Calculate the percentage of energy from trophic level 2 that would be available for trophic level 4. So think, what would be your answer? First, we should calculate the energy passed between each levels. First, we have to subtract 1500, which is the energy loss, from 2300 kilojoules of energy. Then we have to subtract 690 from 760 kilojoules, and we have to get a percentage using these two values. Almost all ecosystems depends on energy of the sun. The light energy that a producer gets determines the rate at which they can make organic materials, and it in turn determines the production of biomass within those ecosystems. Only a very small amount of sunlight results in the production of plants. Approximately it's 1 to 3%, and 99% of the energy will move through it or get reflected. The rate at which the 1% of light help the production of new materials inside a plant is known as the gross primary productivity. At the same time, plant has to survive. It's doing respiration. That's where most of the energy goes. And also a small percentage of it goes to what we call the net primary productivity, where new materials produced by photosynthesis and stored inside plant body tissues. As we consider this equation, that's equal to the amount of energy plant gets when the energy of respiration is subtracted by the gross primary productivity. GPP can be measured in units of biomass in an area over a time of period, or in other words, grams of carbon assimilated per meter squared per year. If we look at the productivity of the planet, we can see that the net primary productivity varies among ecosystems, and they depend on so many factors such as solar energy input, temperature and moisture levels, carbon dioxide levels, and so on. These factors affect how many producers are present to capture light energy and how efficiently they can perform their role. As you can see in these representations, the tropical rainforests have a high productivity. But when it comes to deserts, it's not the situation, as a desert is not a very productive ecosystem. And aquatic ecosystems like coral reefs are extremely productive. In the bottom here, you have a representation of how the net primary productivity changes on a shorter time scale in a dynamic map. Here we can see seasonal and year-to-year variations in net primary productivity of terrestrial ecosystems across the globe. Ecological efficiency. It is the ratio of net primary productivity at one trophic level to net primary productivity at the trophic level below it. This given diagram is an investigation done by a group of scientists who conducted an experiment in an aquatic ecosystem at Silver Springs, Florida. The producers in this ecosystem are mostly aquatic plants. The herbivores include snails, insects, shrimps, fish or turtles. The carnivores include a variety of invertebrates and fish, and top carnivores are large fish. The researchers estimated the biomass and energy content of each trophic level. Here, this ecosystem converts 1.2% of solar energy. They interpret into chemical energy, which is represented by 20,810 kilocalorie per meter squared per year. Then they use about 2/3 of this energy for respiration, leaving 1/3 of energy to be included in new plant biomass. So what's the amount which makes to the next level? It's 3,368 kilocalorie. So what's the ecological efficiency? So this is how you calculate the ecological efficiency. %16 is moved to the level of the first consumer from producers. From first to second consumer, nearly 11% of energy is moved, and from the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumer, 5% of energy is transferred. So we can say that the overall ecological efficiency of most organisms is between 5% to 20%. When we take about efficiency of energy transfer, it's important to include the decomposers as well, because they break down the bodies or dead bodies of plants and animals and their feces. The low ecological efficiencies that characterize most energy transfers illustrates one advantage of eating lower on the food chain. Humans might be able to find or feed many food for more people if all ate more vegetables directly instead of first passing these crops through another trophic level, such as cattle or chicken, to produce meat. So think about that logic too. So here is an illustration of the carbon cycle. Carbon atoms provide the backbone of most biological molecules, and carbon compounds stores the energy captured by photosynthesis. Carbon enters food webs when producers convert atmospheric carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Heterotrophs acquire carbon by eating other organisms. Although carbon moves somewhat independently in the sea and on land, a common atmospheric pool of carbon dioxide creates a global carbon cycle. The largest carbon reservoir is sedimentary rock, such as limestone or marble. Most available carbon is present as dissolved bicarbonate ions in the ocean, soil, atmosphere, and plant biomass from other significant but much smaller sinks. Atmospheric carbon is mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, a product of respiration. Carbon atoms were also transferred to the unavailable organic compartment when soft-bodied organisms were buried in habitats under suitable geological conditions. These carbon-rich tissues were slowly converted to petroleum, gas, coal, which humans now use as fossil fuels. Human activities like industrial processes, agricultural practices, and development often disrupts the biogeochemical cycles by moving materials from one nutrient compartment to the other at unnaturally rapid rates. So, here we consider the consequences of human disruption on the carbon cycle. The combustion of fossil fuels, oil, coal, peat, and wood is transferring carbon from the reservoir of organic nutrients to the atmospheric reservoir of inorganic nutrients. Virtually all scientists agree that the resulting change in the worldwide distribution of carbon is having severe consequences for Earth's climate, including global warming, that will cause a significant rise in sea level. Concentration of certain gases in the lower atmosphere have a profound effect on global temperature, which in turn has enormous impact on global climate. Molecules of carbon dioxide, water, ozone, nitrous oxide collectively act like a pane of glass in a greenhouse. They allow short wavelength of visible light to reach Earth's surface, but they impede the escape of longer IR wavelength back into space, trapping much of the energy as heat. In short, greenhouse gases foster the accumulation of heat in the lower atmosphere, a process known as the greenhouse effect. There has been an enormous increase in the production of carbon dioxide by people since the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. The industrially related output of carbon dioxide, combined with the development of the internal combustion engine for cars and other vehicles, is now threatening the balance of the carbon cycle. So try to find more and more consequences related to the disturbances of carbon cycle. Greenhouse effect and global warming. We will move on to this part. And the earth we live has liquid water, which is the essential necessity for life on earth. So the temperature of the earth plays an important role for the existence of liquid water on earth. It's not too hot or not too cold. When radiation from the sun reaches the earth, some is reflected back into the space by atmosphere and by the surface of the earth, and some is absorbed by the atmosphere. Energy from the sun travels to the earth as short wavelength radiation, for example UV and visible light. Some of the short wave radiation simply reflects back into the space, but most of it passes easily through the atmosphere because short wavelength radiation does not interact strongly with the gas molecules in the atmosphere. The energy of the radiation is absorbed when it reaches the surface of the earth. The surface of the earth now radiates the energy as long wavelength radiation. So that radiation is infrared radiation. Some of the long wavelength radiation interacts with the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. For example, gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrous oxide and methane. The energy is trapped in the atmosphere and it causes the temperature of the atmosphere to increase. There is an important idea about the greenhouse effect. It keeps the temperature on earth warm enough to support life. Without the greenhouse effect, the earth would be too cold for most living organisms to survive. So in simple words, according to the diagram, here the energy comes in, some get reflected and some get absorbed by the earth's surface, and then it's re-emitted back from the earth's surface as IR radiation. However, the absorption of greenhouse gases increase the temperature of the atmosphere unusually because it is linked to human activities, which increases the amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That is the global warming process. Burning fossil fuels, incomplete combustion, excessive amounts of domestic electrical consumption and chemical industries causes the greenhouse gases to increase in the atmosphere. Now we will take a look at the different types of evidence for climate change. There are anecdotal evidences which are not scientific measurements but are memories of people and their perceptions. These evidences are not reliable, so we need some sort of a scientific evidence to do this. First type of scientific evidence is the temperature records. Temperature has been recorded using specialized instruments over time, and those records have been kept to investigate whether the temperature has been changing over a long period of time. Here I have quoted some data that has been published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, based on the collected data from a variety of sources to show how the temperature at the surface of the land and the oceans has changed starting from 1850. This is called the hockey stick graph because of the shape of the graph. So, if the responsible authorities make sensible decisions, these type of data can be used as good scientific evidence to back up the theories of climate change. Another major temperature proxy is the ice core evidence. We will look at why oxygen isotope signals exist and how we interpret these signals climatically. There are compartments of Earth system such as hydrosphere, atmosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, frozen water, and so on. So oxygen is present in each of these compartments. Also it's a oxygen exists in the atmosphere as oxygen gas and also a component of water vapor in the atmosphere. Water molecules in the oceans have oxygen as a component, and also water molecules in the glaciers have oxygen as a component element. Oxygen has 8 protons and 8 neutrons in the nucleus, and most oxygen molecules have an atomic mass of 16. A very small percentage of oxygen exists with 8 protons and 10 neutrons with an atomic mass of 18. So, oxygen 18 and oxygen 16 are isotopes of oxygen, and they are often referred to as heavy and light isotopes respectively. If we take a look at the relative abundance of heavy to light oxygen isotopes, there is a certain ratio of these isotopes of oxygen in each of the previously mentioned reservoirs in the Earth system. The transfer of oxygen isotopes depends on temperature. When ocean water evaporates, water with lighter oxygen isotope, which is O16, evaporates slightly more readily than oxygen 18 isotope, which is heavier. So, scientists took this into consideration and investigate Antarctic and Greenland ice cores to get data to show how temperature of the surface of the Earth has fluctuated over time. The third type of evidence is dendrochronological evidences. Dendrochronology is another temperature proxy. In a stem, the vascular bundle is arranged in a ring. Every year, a new layer of this vascular bundle is produced. If we cut a stem of a tree, which is its stem, you can find these rings correspond to the annual addition of new layers of the xylem tissue. Each ring corresponds to a year of growth. Depending on the conditions, you will get thicker rings and thinner rings. Thicker rings indicate more growth and thinner rings indicate less growth. We can take climate information through these rings, but there are limitations of this method as well, as ring growth is dependent on so many factors other than temperature. Peat Bog Records. Peat bogs is another source of data for temperature proxy. Peat bogs have very anaerobic and acidic conditions, and these conditions prevent plant materials from being decayed or decomposed completely. So, things like pollen grains are preserved in peat bogs, and we can dig these cores out of the ground and take samples and analyze them. By analyzing these samples, we can get a clear idea of what kind of plants were present at the time when the peat was being formed. A lot of evidence from many studies now suggests a clear correlation between the rise in the levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the increase in global temperature. This has taken us to a point where it's difficult to decide whether increase in greenhouse gases are causing the increase in temperature or are the result of rising temperature. Correlation is not the same as causation. It's like the two sides of a fence. One side, you can believe that human activity is causing an increase in greenhouse gases. On the other side of the fence, we can argue that as the causation has not been proved, we can't say exactly that the humans are the cause of global temperature increase. As we can see in this graph, there is a close correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations, and this graph is based on the data from Antarctic ice cores. Predicting future climate. Now we talked about the evidence of climate change and human impact on climate change. And it's important to get some sort of a prediction about climate change in the future. Until today, we have collected a certain amount of data on climate change. So based on this data, we should see whether we can predict the future. And climate change data are not like these data, which gives you a straight trend or a line. This is just a representation that I have taken to explain the concept of developing models to predict climate changes and its trends in the future. So what is extrapolation? It's like this. Basically, we have got some data or points which we can build a relationship, and based on that data, we are going to estimate or predict what will happen in the future. When extrapolating, we can start to predict the values we might get from numbers or data that we have not collected yet. So, responsible environmental authorities can take necessary steps to reduce the negative consequences which will happen and take preventive measures for the potential impacts of climate change. These climate models are mathematical representations done by using high-tech computers and equipments. Now we discuss the fact that the increased levels of greenhouse gases added to the atmosphere by people and how we destroy the natural carbon sinks and disturb the natural biogeochemical cycles such as carbon cycle. Now we have to consider the effects of these changes on our climate and on extreme weather events, and also we have to think how these changes might affect living organisms including humans. So when we consider the biological impacts, there are few types of them. The first one is changes in temperature and seasons. Climate change already involves changes in temperature, and we know that temperature has an effect on enzyme activity of an organism. The graph below here shows or give you a review on the enzyme kinetics. It's the effect of temperature on enzyme activity. As you can see, in the beginning of the activity, it's very low. As the temperature increases, the enzyme activity increases until it gets to an optimum temperature here. Then after that, further increase in temperature results in reduction in enzyme activity. So in this case, it's important to learn about temperature coefficient or Q10, and for any reaction between 0 Celsius to 40 Celsius, Q10 is equal to 2. However, beyond the optimum temperature point, enzyme starts to denature. So increasing temperature could have different effects on the rate of growth and reproduction. Most animal species live in tropics and have no proper adaptive measures to huge temperature ranges. So most tropical organisms that have no adaptations to changing temperature levels will no longer survive in this rapidly changing climatic environments. Even their breeding cycles and behavioral patterns get disrupted by the temperature changes. Changes in species distribution. So let me ask a question from you. Why are the species located in a certain area? So, well, it's because the distribution depends on factors like climate, topography, abundance of food, and so on. The changes in climates is affecting species distribution via changes in growth, reproduction, and mortality. The changes in the climate can directly influence a species. Let's take an example to explain this. So, vector-borne diseases such as malaria are transmitted by an infected mosquito, Anopheles. According to the given map here, it shows the new areas where the malaria parasite Plasmodium falciparum will likely to be able to spread by the year 2050. So, based on the predictions of climate change models, they have interpreted this. So, organisms are going to be more abundant in the conditions where that suits their adaptations. Climate change and evolution. In this section, we will be discussing the connection between the climate change and evolution process. We focus on the idea of climate change as a selection pressure here. In Form 6, we discuss how evolution can come about through gene mutation and natural selection. And we have some sort of an idea how isolation reduces the gene flow of a population and in turn result speciation. Keep in mind, as the environment changes, organisms evolve in response to that change. If the changes are too rapid or dramatic changes, which are not gradual changes, in that case, organisms would not be able to adapt, as evolution relies on random events. The graph here is the sigmoidal curve of population growth, and it represents the changes of the population growth over time. In stage A, the population has low numbers initially, and the increase of the population is very gentle. With the time, the population gets adapted to its environment, and it comes to this exponential growth phase denoted by B. In this section, the rate of reproduction is high. However, gradually it reaches to a point where the population is using the resources excessively, and death rate starts to catch up with the birth rate, and it will reach a point like this. So, in this situation, there could be other factors like limited food resources, space, and so on. Then it reaches to the carrying capacity point of that environment. So, D is that phase. These are the main stages of growth that each and every population has to go through. And in D part, the birth and death rates are equal, almost equal, and many individuals may not get a chance to reproduce. The process of evolution starts from here onwards. The organisms who are dying in the last stage do not have the alleles to give them a survival advantage, whereas the organisms that do survive have alleles that give them the better chance of survival, and those alleles increase in frequency over time, whereas the organisms that don't have alleles for adaptations, they have a very less chance of passing that alleles to the next generation. So, allele frequencies are changing over time, therefore, the population is evolving. If every single allele from one generation made to the next generation after hundreds or thousands of years, the populations would be genetically the same as before. If a population have a high genetic variability, there will be a higher probability to get combinations of alleles, which will in turn allow the survival of that species in that particular population. So let's have a look on speciation. So in evolution, a population will adapt to a certain selection pressure and become an advanced population. Whereas in speciation, the current population will be two populations which are new. In speciation, one of the main drivers is isolation. Let's look at this example here. There is a population named A. Somehow over time the population is subjected to a separation. It could be a physical separation or a geographical isolation. So we name it as allophatric speciation. So it could be a mechanical or behavioral or seasonal change. So in that situation we can name it as sympatric speciation. So because of the speciation, there will be a lack of gene flow between these two separated populations. So as the two populations are separated, there will be no reproduction between these two populations. Because of the random mutation over time, the two populations starts to accumulate genetic differences. Eventually, over hundreds of years, the two populations will become so different. So in the beginning there was population A, at the end there were two completely different populations as B and S. So let's say after hundreds of years this barrier is removed. Even the barrier is removed, after all these years the two different populations will not be able to produce fertile offsprings after reproduction. Now let's have a look on the consequences of enhanced global warming. There will be complete meltdown of polar ice caps and the glaciers of mountain regions, releasing vast amounts of water into the sea. So the sea levels will rise. Warming of sea waters causing them to expand in volume and further rising the sea levels. Flooding of much low land can occur. Sea temperature levels will rise up. Destruction of forest habitats and interruptions of ocean current systems. Disruption of agricultural production levels can occur. So find out more about the consequences of enhanced global warming. Planning for the future. The idea of sustainability comes in handy when we take a look at strong and effective actions that can be taken to combat the consequences of climate change. If we take a look on the human population for the last 10,000 years, we see an exponential growth, and we now have exceeded the number of 7 billion when it comes to the global population. So we are going to have to make sure the resources we have on our planet will last for the future generations. So sustainability is the production of a decent standard of living for everyone without compromising the needs of future generations or the ecosystems around us. We have to conserve fossil fuels, using them wisely and only where there are no apparent alternatives. We can rely on sustainable energy resources like solar power, wind power. We can develop biofuels that will naturally decay, and we can use renewable energy sources more and more. We can encourage reforestation or replanting of trees in an area where there are no trees. Governments can implement laws to minimize the anthropogenic greenhouse gas production from industries. So think globally, act locally. Your actions are needed in the fight against the climate change. So here are some questions for you. I hope you will try these questions and try to do the exam practice questions on page number 84 and 85 in your textbook. So if we summarize the lesson, we discuss about food chains and food webs. We discuss about trophic levels, ecological pyramids, and the definitions of GPP and NPP. We discuss ecological efficiency. We discuss about carbon cycle and human influences which disrupts the natural carbon cycle. We discuss about the greenhouse effect and global warming. We discuss the evidences for climate change and the climate models that we can use to predict the future of the climate. And we discuss the biological impacts on climate change, changes in species distribution, and so we discuss about the concept speciation and the consequences of global warming, and we discuss how to plan our future. So these are some references. Hope you have enjoyed the lesson. Try to do more questions on this lesson, and thank you very much.